So, throughout its 30-year existence, Resident Evil as a game franchise is known in large part due to the many remakes of the classic games in newer generations. And up to date, we've seen the first four mainline numbered entries in the game get remakes. And I believe to date, the Resident Evil game series is the most remade franchise of any video game out there. I could be wrong. I haven't really done extensive research, but it just seems like there has not been another game series that has remade as many main series games as Resident Evil. Now, with the remake comes a little bit of controversy among fans. There are those who absolutely adore and appreciate what the remakes do, and there are the others who either prefer to leave the old games in the past or do not like what the remakes have done and added to these games. There's a lot of people I've seen who are sick of this quote unquote remake culture, but in reality, without the remakes, the Resident Evil series would not have evolved as far as it has gotten today. And to say that the remakes are just definitively not as good as the originals is pretty objectively false. Now, granted, there are some of the remakes that had not had the same level of care and or of development time as others, but the remakes in reality are probably some of the greatest games we've got in this series. And let's start with the main game that kicked it off, the original Resident Evil. In 2002, merely 6 years after the first game was released, Capcom decided to remake the first Resident Evil game on the Nintendo GameCube of all consoles. And to me, what really sticks out about this remake is compared to the other ones, this one was released a mere 6 years after the first one, and only one generation of consoles removed from the original PlayStation 1. Most of the other remakes in the series have not come out until at least 10 years later. You look at Resident Evil 2, that was 21 years later. Same thing with Resident Evil 3, and Resident Evil 4 was just about 20 years later. And now that I mention it, it's kind of insane just how long this series has expanded and how long it's been continuously revolutionizing itself and changing the game industry. The Resident Evil 1 remake, it really changed the entire game. It took what you remember of the original, and even the original trilogy for that matter, and it gave it a complete overhaul while maintaining the same integrity, the same feel and atmosphere that the original games gave you. With much higher visuals, dynamic lighting, smoother gameplay, and it took the tone of the story and turned it into something a bit more serious. Now, we still didn't have Metal Gear Solid levels of voice acting and performances, but at the very least, you weren't cringing at every single line of dialogue. And yeah, I get that the campiness was a bit of the charm in the original Resident Evil, and the remake still has its moments here and there. But looking at it as just a serious game, and taking the story and the environment more seriously, a darker tone, it really did fix out that little bit of jank that kind of made the first Resident Evil game just a little comical and ridiculous. It actually felt like it had gravity. And aside from retelling the story one-to-one, they added a lot new areas. They expanded a lot on the backstory of the creation of the mansion with its creator, George Trevor, and his daughter, Lisa Trevor, who became a prominent figure and a monster in the game. That was genuinely one of the most terrifying creatures in probably the entire Resident Evil series. When most people talk about Resident Evil 1, they are mainly referring to the remake. That is the de facto version of the first Resident Evil game. And funny enough, the remake in 2002 ended up getting a re-release, a remastered version, much later on for the PlayStation 3 and onward. But it was still a phenomenal looking game, especially for the time. At the time when the GameCube was still known for just being family-friendly Mario, Zelda games, you have this violent horror game that is so cerebral and puts you right into the shoes of these characters in the Spencer Mansion. Just truly incredible, truly incredible. And I think to say that the Resident Evil 1 remake alone isn't a better game than Resident Evil 1 is just false. Like, you're on something. You're snorting the same thing that Christoph Gans is taking, before he directed Return to Silent Hill. So moving on to the next mainline game in the series, Resident Evil 2. And that's a game that fans had wanted a remake for the longest time. I think ever since the Resident Evil 1 remake came out, people wanted to see Resident Evil 2 redone. You got a few ports. You got some ports to the Nintendo GameCube, which looked smoother, looked a little cleaner, but was still the same game. It was not a remake by any means. And then you eventually got some spin-offs like the Dark Side Chronicles, which retold the story of the original Resident Evil games, but really just lacked any of the Resident Evil flavor. It was an on-rails shooter. It was very linear, and it was just a very condensed version of it. It doesn't really stand on its own as its own game. Flash forward to 2019, and the actual proper Resident Evil 2 remake had finally come out. This was 4 years after one of the developers at Capcom just made almost an underwhelming announcement, or just, I should say, out of nowhere, just randomly said that they're going to remake Resident Evil 2, and nobody knew if this was like some sort of a prank or a joke, but it turned out to be the real thing. And boy, what Resident Evil 2 remake did for the original Resident Evil 2 was, in my opinion, on level with what Resident Evil Remake did for Resident Evil 1. This time around, though, the formula was very different, because instead of keeping the fixed camera angles that the original Resident Evil 2 had, we now shifted over to the much more modern gameplay style of Resident Evil, which is third person over the shoulder. And right there, that had a lot of fans set off. And I think that is a large part of the divisiveness of the people who like the remakes and the people who do not like the remakes. So you get a certain number of fans who would have preferred a direct shot-for-shot remake, fixed camera angles and all, which, still could have worked and still probably would have been effective. But to discredit the game just because it's third person over the shoulder is not a very fair critique, especially considering that this game oozes atmosphere. And it gave legitimacy to the zombies in this game. And that's important because throughout the series, I think the actual scare factor of the zombies diminished from game to game, and it got to the point where it's like, all right, just another zombie. We know how to take care of them. They're easy prey. They're not terrifying at all. You don't freak out when you see them. But in the Resident Evil 2 remake, just one zombie could royally mess your day up. And how persistent they were. They kept coming, and they were hard to kill. You could hardly actually kill a zombie in Resident Evil 2 Remake without completely destroying its head or its legs. And the fact that they would kind of just blindside you and gang up on you and come out from the shadows, it really brought this new terrifying factor back to the zombies. And it was really refreshing going into a game and actually being scared of actually worrying about getting to the next save point, or in this case, checkpoint systems. Although it did introduce a hardcore mode, which returned to the original style of saving with ink ribbons. And I think that the Resident Evil 2 Remake hardcore mode is probably the closest modern day game that I felt was similar to the OG games. It reworked Mr. X in a phenomenal way. It added a whole new level of tension to the game as he started pursuing you after a certain point, and you literally couldn't shake the guy. He was not just a scripted enemy that came up at certain times. He was spawned in the map, so at any given time you could run into this guy and you couldn't take him down, and you died very easily just in a few hits. The visuals of the RPD, of the characters, of the retouched story even, really gave the game new life. And it was the familiar yet unfamiliar. Like, you know the place, you know the setting, you know the story, but the way it unfolded was so perfectly crafted. I don't have enough good things to say about it. They added a lot new details, and again, a much more emphasized performance on the actor's end. To me, that is the definitive way of experiencing Resident Evil 2. Now that brings us to quite possibly, more, not quite possibly, but most definitely the most divisive remake in the series, Resident Evil 3. Now, I've made some short little videos before praising the game. I do enjoy the game for what it is. Now, one thing that I want to clarify is that I don't think that it is a perfect remake. I don't think it's a great remake of Resident Evil 3. They definitely did cut out a lot of parts of the game, and it did feel underwhelming compared to the Resident Evil 2 remake that we got. I still enjoy the game. I still think that the parts that they did include in the remake were well done. I think the story, again, was well told. But yeah, it was a very lacking remake. And I think when people judge that game, that's the criteria that they're looking at the most, is that it left out a lot of the original Resident Evil 3, which it did. Another thing about that remake that I don't like is the fact that it was charged as a full price game, which if the price was probably cut in half to about $30 upon release, or better yet, if that was like just DLC to the Resident Evil 2 remake, it probably would have received a lot better by fans. But it wasn't. It was its own game, full price and everything. And that probably, that is one of the main reasons that most fans don't like it. Nemesis, I feel, was the biggest disappointment in the sense that you could have had him like a Mr. X, spawn in the map, showing up at any time to mess your day up. Just being this terrifying, persistent pursuer, which to me, Nemesis was always just that much higher than Mr. X. Like, Mr. X was scary, but Nemesis was the head honcho, the baddest of the bad. In the original Resident Evil 3 remake, that game still gives me anxiety to this day whenever I know I'm about to encounter Nemesis. And I just didn't feel that with the Resident Evil 3 remake. They rushed it. They condensed a lot of parts of it. Really disappointing because, like I said, I enjoyed the parts that were in there, and I still think it's a solid game overall. Crucify me for that. But yeah, I definitely see why, the Resident Evil 3 remake has fans divided. And perhaps that's one of the main reasons why some newer fans, or even someone who may look at like that remake and say, oh, well, see, this is why they ruin all the original games. This is why remakes are bad. But it's like, no. You can't just look at one remake that was not done very well and then say, oh, well, the Resident Evil 1 remake was bad or the Resident Evil 2 remake was bad. I can see your arguments for Resident Evil 3. I don't see the arguments of how Resident Evil 1 into ruined the game or how it changed the characters for the worse. And it made them a lot more grounded, down to earth. Like Leon, you actually felt was this rookie police officer. Claire, you actually felt was this young teenager that was looking for her brother and very vulnerable. It brought a level of realism to them. And again, it's like familiar yet unfamiliar. Like, these characters, but you reintroduce them in a much more, down to earth type of way. And I love the characterization. Some people love the original voice actors. I love the original voice actors. Alison Cord as Claire, Paul Haddad as Leon. But I think the newer iterations also did a fine job. Resident Evil 4 stands as, at this point, the last Resident Evil mainline game that has been remade. And I don't really have my finger on the pulse of the fans' reaction. From what I've seen, it's overall positive. I love Resident Evil 4 Remake. Playing it for the first time, it brought back a lot of the similar memories of OG Resident Evil 4, and it is one of the games that I continuously play to this day. Every playthrough is just so fresh. The inventory system with the weapon upgrades gives the game that dynamicness. What I can say about the Resident Evil 4 Remake is that it re-added a lot of the horror elements to that game, to Resident Evil 4. And it did it in such a way that mirrored what Resident Evil 4 OG did, in the sense that it was, largely an action game, but kept a lot of these horror elements. Resident Evil 4 Remake really brought back home to that horror element, and it actually made Resident Evil 4 a more scary experience than the original. And I think that's hard to do. I think that's hard to do in today's gaming scape, especially the Resident Evil world, where, a lot of the games became a lot more action-based. And especially since that game was remade off a game that is kind of infamously known for taking the series in a much more action, adventure, thriller, type of genre. But I feel like they did a great job. Again, the moody lighting, these environments were redone in a much more like gothic feel. The enemies were a lot more deadly too in this remake. I still have not beaten professional mode. It is pretty difficult. Leon progressed very nicely from Resident Evil 2 Remake, so it's clear that they were going off of his character from RE2 Remake and building upon that, rather than just trying to rehash the same cool, cocky, just over-the-top character that was in OG Resident Evil 4, and that we kind of saw in Resident Evil 6 as well. So all this to say, the Resident Evil series is definitely no short of remakes. Like I said, I think it's the most remade series, at least in terms of the mainline games. So fans still are seemingly divided. There are some who, like me, love the remakes and would love to see more of the previous games get remade, and then the others who are kind of just over them. They're sick of them for whatever reason, whether they don't like them, they think they ruined the characters, which I think is just not true at all. Or maybe they just think enough is enough. They're like, okay, where do you draw the line? And I can kind of see that argument, that remaking everything is like unnecessary. But that kind of brings me to my next point, because there is, speculation / debate over which Resident Evil game should be made next. And the logical two choices from progression is Resident Evil 5 and Resident Evil Code Veronica. Now, I'm always been a big proponent of remaking Resident Evil Code Veronica, and just to be fair, to be clear, I'm a little biased because Code Veronica is one of my favorite games of the series. That being said, I think Code Veronica has a much, much stronger argument than Resident Evil 5 to be remade. As much as I enjoyed the Resident Evil 4 remake, I remember even before that game came out, I said that Resident Evil Code Veronica needed a remake more than Resident Evil 4 did. I was pleasantly surprised what we saw with 4, but I still think that Resident Evil Code Veronica much more deserving of a remake. Now, there are many reasons for that. The main reason I will say that Resident Evil Code Veronica should be remade, like priority, is that it is a much older game than Resident Evil 5. The amount of improvements we would see from a Resident Evil 5 remake would not be as grand, would not be as vast of an improvement as we could see for a Code Veronica. This is a game that originally came out for the Sega Dreamcast in 2000. So imagine what you can do to re-inject Code Veronica into this modern day. Imagine how you can recreate it and just how night and day, how amazing the visuals could be. Resident Evil 5, it came out for the PS3. Like, I don't think that a remake is going to be like that much more groundbreaking or breathtaking or just woo, the wow factor as you would see with Resident Evil Code Veronica. OG Code Veronica had a lot of creepy moments, a lot of great atmosphere, and touched upon with today's standards, it could be terrifying. Now, I know a lot of people are a little dicey on the subject matter of Alfred and Alexia. I say go for it. Go for it. Like, there's no, like, there's no way to not trigger people. And I really don't think that it's what you would consider an offensive storyline. A weird and creepy storyline, yes, but it's not like targeting anyone. It's not putting any one group or person down. So, like, I don't see why people are so dicey about it. It's a story that's creepy, but it fits in line with some of these over-the-top villains of Resident Evil, and especially, Alfred just being this third wheel, forgotten about, soldier of Umbrella. I mean, it makes sense for his character to be unhinged and, in love with his sister. I really don't see no problem with that story. And to that end, the story part of it is one of the things that I like the most, even though most people don't really care for the story in Code Veronica. I think it's really cool because you get that closure between Claire and Chris. You finally have that reunion. And most importantly, you see the return of Albert Wesker. which is a critical part to the series. I think it changed the series forever. Um, if you didn't know, Wesker was not originally supposed to be returning. He was supposed to be dead after the first one, but the fans wanted him back, so they brought him back for Code Veronica, and the rest is history. The series pretty much evolved around Wesker, and bringing him back here, especially since we saw him in Resident Evil 4 remake, I think is very vital to see the origins of how he made his magnificent return to the series. And again, like, when if remade in today's graphics and today's mechanics, that could be a very, very cool moment, seeing the return of Albert Wesker. And hell, there are so many new things you can introduce in this Code Veronica game. You could have some maybe small little fights with Wesker. You can have Alexia functioning as like this horror creature that's following you, especially after she transforms. I kind of envision it in the vein of like a Resident Evil 7, how you have like some of the Baker family following you. Obviously, Alexia is a very different type of creature, but like having her pursue you in the Antarctica mansion could be very horrifying and turn her into like an OTK, a one-hit kill monster, where if she catches you, she lights you on flames. I think that'd be very cool. I think Code Veronica will be very creepy, and the improvements that you would see with the Code Veronica remake is much, much greater than Resident Evil 5. And not to mention, Resident Evil 5 is nowhere near the top of my list of top Resident Evil games. It's not a good game. I'm sorry. It's not. Remaking it won't be good. That's why I think Resident Evil Code Veronica should be remade over Resident Evil 5. Well, again, sound off in the comments. Do you hate remakes? Do you like remakes? What game do you want to see next? Do you want to see Code Veronica? Do you want to see 5? Or do you want to see something else? I mean, there are a lot of other good candidates for games that could be remade. Resident Evil Survivor is kind of like a guilty pleasure of mine. I think would be really cool to redo that in some way, especially since it got such a bad rap when it first came out. And it wasn't necessarily its fault. It's just that the North American version banned the light gun shooter aspect of it due to some other things that were going on in America at that time. I'm not saying that it's a good or bad thing that they did that, but it did really hinder the game's performance, which is a shame, because I think that could be a fun game. Resident Evil Outbreak is another game that could have a remake and actually makes a whole lot of sense, considering that a lot of these newer games are geared towards online play, and that's exactly what Resident Evil Outbreak was. It was very ahead of its time. I feel like if that game had been slotted in today's era, it would have been much more successful. Online play in the mid-2000s was still very preliminary and, at least for most people, a little hard to set up. So that could be a cool game too. Until then, enjoy the rest of your day. Hope you guys are well, and I'll see you next time.